Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chop It Up Sports. As always, I'm your host, Carter Stedman. And man, what a weird week in college football. Week 6 brought 7 ranked teams losing this weekend. 5 of those teams were in the top 12, and 4 out of those 5 losses were to unranked opponents. In this episode, we're going to be going over the implication of these losses, what it's going to look like for these teams going forward, who are the contenders, who are the pretenders, and it's going to be really interesting because we're at the halfway point in the season. Things are starting to get a little bit more intense. We're seeing a lot of games have playoff implications and conference championship implications on the line. And so we're going to get into those losses that we saw this weekend and just kind of, see where these teams are at and test the water a little bit. But before we get into that, I want to take a minute to just promote the pod. For those listening, you can check us out on YouTube and Spotify where we post our full episodes. And for those of you that can't catch the full episodes, be sure to go on Instagram or TikTok where we're posting little clips and snippets throughout the week to bring you guys some content throughout the season. So be sure to go check us out on all those platforms. We're putting out content weekly. The bigger episodes are coming out on the weekend, and then throughout the work week, we'll have those little short clips coming in for you guys. So be sure to like, subscribe, and tell a friend about the Chop It Up Sports podcast because we're making pretty good content out here. So without further ado, I want to get into some of these games. We'll start with USC and Minnesota last night. USC falls to Minnesota on the road, and it was just really a sloppy game for the Trojans. Miller Moss threw for 200 yards. He had 3 turnovers. I guess technically 2 turnovers, and then he had a pass that ended up being fumbled. And this was just a really sloppy game for USC. When you look at it, they, like I mentioned, 3 turnovers. When you're on the road in an environment like Minnesota, you just can't afford to have that. And especially, as we see in the Big Ten now, it's a different brand of football than what we saw in the Pac-12. It's not these Pac-12 after dark games where you can turn it over 3 or 4 times and still put up 40 points on the board and come away with a win. It's a lot more traditional football. It's about prioritizing your possessions, taking advantage of points when you can get them, and winning the turnover battle, winning the penalty battle. And USC just wasn't able to do that last night. When you look at the box score, Minnesota didn't do anything special. They did run for 193 yards as a team, but they just played complementary football. They only had 4 penalties. They only had 1 turnover compared to USC's 3. And PJ Fleck always has his team ready to play. Now, does Minnesota always play up to those expectations? No. But in a big game like this, you have to expect a team like Minnesota to wake up and try and knock off a top 10, top 15 opponent in USC. And that's what they were able to do because they played their brand of football. When you look at USC this year, they're on a different trajectory than what we saw just within the last couple of weeks. 2 weeks ago, we were talking about how good this USC offense was and how much of a threat they could be in the Big Ten this year, even though it's their first season in the conference. And now they're in this really weird spot where they're sitting at 4-2, and they have a loss to Michigan, who doesn't look to be as good as people probably thought they were at the beginning of the season. They fall to Minnesota, who is an unranked opponent. I'm not saying Minnesota's bad, but they're definitely not the same level as some teams USC is going to have to face later this season. And so to me, it just puts them in this weird spot where, they're not completely out of it. They have to go to Penn State. They get Notre Dame at home at the end of the season. So if they could win those games and win out the remaining schedule, then yeah, maybe they're in contention for, a number 10 or 11 seed in the playoff. But as of now, with 2 conference losses and with how deep the Big Ten is this season, it definitely puts the Trojans behind the 8 ball, and I don't love where they're at right now. It just feels like they're almost a little bit too reliant on their offense. I think their defense is better than it's been in years past, but I'm just not sure if the offense isn't rolling and putting up 30 to 40 points a game, if they're going to be able to win. It just seems like Miller Moss has been kind of inconsistent the last couple weeks, and I don't know if teams have just found a way to kind of stop him or make adjustments on the fly. I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but he just hasn't had that same pop that we saw earlier in the year when they picked up that big win against LSU. So as he kind of works through a little bit of a slump right now, I think USC is their season is going to go as Miller Moss goes. If he can turn it around and pick it up, then I think they're going to be okay and they could find themselves in the top 15. However, if he continues to struggle and this offense continues to turn the ball over and punt and miss field goals and just play sloppy football, then they're going to find themselves in a pretty bad spot. And that's just really weird to me when we saw how dangerous this team looked in the first 3 weeks of the season compared to these last few weeks where they lose to some teams in games that they probably should have won. Even when you look at the Michigan game, you look back and you probably think, yeah, they were in control of that game for a majority of the time, and Michigan just broke open a couple big runs that ultimately gave them the win. And, even if they do lose to Michigan and they win out the rest of their schedule, they're in a good spot. But when you drop a game like this, it just really puts things in jeopardy. And that's what makes this 12-team playoff so interesting, is that on any given weekend, you could drop a game to an inferior opponent, and that just messes up your whole season. And I think we saw that this week in Minnesota. Moving on to the next Big Ten game, the Washington Huskies got their revenge in a rematch of last year's national championship game. This was my upset of the week, so it finally feels good to get one right. It only took me 6 weeks, so happy about that. And once again, Michigan, this is a team we've talked about a lot this year. Just a really weird team, right? They don't bring a lot of talent back from last year's championship team, but they don't have a quarterback. Donovan Edwards comes back. This run game is really good. Their offensive line is solid. Colston Loveland, they have good wide receiver weapons, but the quarterback play has just hurt them time and time again this season as they pick up their first conference loss, second loss of the season. And it just seems like this Michigan team is just so out of rhythm because they don't have any consistent quarterback play. A couple weeks ago, we talked about how Alex Orji found a way for the Wolverines to pick up that win against USC at home. And it looked like maybe that could have been the change in the season where they get some momentum and they just say, okay, we're going to run the ball, we're going to play smash mouth football, and we're going to live and die by that. And that is how they played this last weekend. But at the same time, the quarterback play is just so bad that it puts them in jeopardy in almost every game because, yeah, it's great if you can run the ball. And if you're playing a team that doesn't have a great front seven, then yeah, maybe you will have some success moving the ball down the field and you can put points on the board, which ultimately makes that better on your defense. But at the same time, if you're a top 10, top 15 team, if you're the reigning national champions, I just don't understand how you can't have a quarterback on your roster who's competent to move the ball downfield. Jack Tuttle came in the second quarter of yesterday's game after benching Alex Orji. Washington had jumped out to a 14-0 lead at that point, and Michigan just had nothing going. And Tuttle moved the ball a little bit. He wasn't terrible. He had 98 yards passing. He had a touchdown. But at the same time, he had an interception and a fumble that cost them the game. And to me, this Michigan team just looks super out of whack. We saw Donovan Edwards and how frustrated he was with his nonverbals throughout the game. And I think you kind of just feel that vibe with the whole team. Like, man, if we just had someone that could move the ball downfield with their arm, they would be fine. They don't need a Quinn Ewers or a Cam Ward. They just need a system quarterback, a guy that can make the right throws, make the right reads, and they just don't have that. When you look at their depth chart from top to bottom, Davis Warren, not great with his arm, and he can't run. Alex Orji can't throw to save his life, and he is a threat as a runner, but when you are one-dimensional like that, it's pretty easy to game plan for that. So they throw in Jack Tuttle, the seventh-year senior. Me personally, if I'm a seventh-year senior and I'm a third string on the depth chart, might be time to go find a job. But nevertheless, he comes in yesterday in the second quarter of the game. And, we saw the Michigan offense start to move the ball a little bit. They scored 17 unanswered points to take the lead early in that third quarter. But when it mattered most, they just couldn't move the ball downfield. And that's because that when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, Michigan's going to run the ball. And they're going to find ways to make it second and short, third and short. But when that gets so repetitive that the defense is able to game plan for that, it's hard to win football games. And I think a lot of credit has to go to Steve Belichick, the Washington offensive coordinator, and the adjustments he was able to make late in yesterday's game. For a minute there, it looked like Michigan was really in control. They had the lead. They were burning a lot of clock. They were moving the ball pretty efficiently with their run game. And then all of a sudden, it just takes a turn where Jack Tuttle has the fumble on the quarterback run. And then the next possession, he throws an interception. And ultimately, that resulted in 10 unanswered points for the Huskies. And that's what gave them the lead. When you look at it, it was 17-17. Michigan fumbles. After getting an interception off of a Will Rogers pass, opportunity for them to go score, they answer back with their fumble of their own. Washington goes and puts it in the end zone, and then ultimately the interception by Cam Fabiculanan that kind of sealed the deal. This game was strange to me. I really feel like it was similar to the USC game where Michigan just, they tried to play their brand of football, and it just didn't work. And I think as good as this Washington offense has looked at times, the defense is what got them the win ultimately. I just talked about their turnovers. They kept their composure when Michigan stormed back. And I think that's kind of what is interesting about this Washington team. Obviously, as you can see by what I'm wearing, I follow this team pretty closely. But, they have a lot of talent. The talent is not the question for this Washington team. It's the fact that you bring in Jed Fish in his first year, Steve Belichick, Brendan Carroll, a brand new coaching staff, and you combine that with only 2 to 3 starters that returned from last year's team. And it's just hard to win games like that. And we've seen that this year with this Washington squad, losing close games. They lose the Apple Cup to Washington State on the last play of the game. They go to Piscataway last week on a Friday night in Rutgers, and they miss 3 field goals, and they lose by 3. And so that's just what's going to happen when you have an inexperienced team. You're going to have those games where there's just bumps in the road. But then at the same time, you're going to have games where, the number 10 team in the country comes into town and you put a whooping on them. And so I think this Washington team, they're trending in the right direction. Now, do I think they're going to be some sort of serious contender or make a run? No. But I do think that they can be a dark horse in the Big Ten and just kind of play spoiler for a lot of these teams in the conference. So as Michigan continues to go up and down, I think their season is going to be pretty rocky from here on out. When you look at their next 6 games, 4 of them are ranked opponents, and it's just going to get ugly. They get Oregon at home. They have Ohio State at the end of the year, obviously. And if they can't find a way to move the ball down the field with their quarterback, I just don't know what the rest of their season looks like. Maybe they can pick up a couple wins, but I just don't see them beating a team like the Oregons or the Ohio States, especially when you just don't have a quarterback. And that's really the only problem. And that's why I've talked about it so much on this show, is the defense is great. Their defensive line is outstanding. But when your defense is constantly on the field, it is impossible for you to win big games if your offense cannot put points on the board efficiently. And Michigan just can't do that. And so I think going forward, they're in a tough spot. It'll be interesting to see what Sharon Moore does this offseason, whether he goes to the portal or if they have a quarterback come in the recruiting class. Really interested to see where this Michigan team goes. So as we move on from the Big Ten to the other power conference, the SEC, man, what a blunder it was for top 10 teams in the SEC this weekend. Missouri goes on the road to Texas A&M in a game that I had Missouri winning handedly and could not have been more wrong about that one. Texas A&M blew the doors off of them, 41-10. I like Missouri's schedule going forward. They do have to go to Alabama. We'll get more into that here in a second. Tennessee goes into Arkansas after picking up a big win a couple weeks ago against Oklahoma. Nico Iamaleava, he was due for a bad game. He's been outstanding this year. I think Tennessee's still in a good position as well, but this was not a good showing for the Volunteers offense. And then finally, maybe the game of the weekend, Vandy finally beats Alabama after being 0-60 against top 5 opponents in college football in the history of their program. The last 2 meetings, Alabama has outscored Vandy by a combined 100-0. That's right, 100 to zilch. And this Bama defense, to me, just didn't even seem to show up. And I think in the second half of the Georgia game last week, we saw a little bit of that where Georgia finally found some deep plays downfield and opened up their offense a little bit. And Vandy just put points on the board. When you watch this game, I mean, yeah, Jalen Milroe had a pick 6. That obviously came back to hurt them as they lose by 5 points. But the defense just can't get stops. And it's kind of the opposite of the Michigan situation, right? Where, yeah, it's great that your offense can score, but if your defense can't stop the other team, then how much does that really matter, right? And so I kind of want to put these games all into one because they all are top 10 teams when you look at Missouri, Tennessee, and Bama. Now, do I think they're on the same levels as each other? Not necessarily, but it's going to be a little round robin as we approach the second half of the season. Missouri has to go to Alabama, like I mentioned. They have some tough games to finish out their schedule, and they're going to have to win out if they want a chance to make this playoff. I do think a loss to Texas A&M isn't going to kill them, but they're going to have to beat Bama. They're going to have to play clean football and win out in order for them to get a chance at that college football playoff. So I think it'll be interesting. And I also do believe that Missouri had this one coming. They looked a little too comfortable in the past few weeks. Obviously, they almost lost to Vanderbilt last weekend, and they get away with the win there due to a missed field goal. And then the week before that, Boston College gave them a run for their money at home. And so I think this Missouri team is experienced. I think Brady Cook is a really good quarterback, and Luther Burden is a serious weapon. I really like how Eli Drinkowitz runs his program. But I just think Texas A&M may have heard a lot of the noise coming in, and including me. I was not a believer in this Texas A&M team. I feel like we just see their name in the media a lot about how good they could potentially be, and they just haven't lived up to that hype. But credit to Mike Elko. He had this team ready to play. They came in at home at Kyle Field and took care of business and put a smacking on Missouri. So credit to them. Like I said earlier, I think Missouri has a chance to be okay, but it will be interesting to see how they respond to this loss in the following weeks. Moving on to the next game, number 4 Tennessee falls to Arkansas in just kind of a bloodbath. This was a really sloppy game. It was slow scoring. I think the final score was 19-14 Arkansas. And if you're the Razorbacks, that's exactly how you want that game to go, right? Nico Iamaleava, we know that his team can put points on the board, but they just really weren't able to. And all credit goes to this Arkansas defense. They came ready to play. I think Nico might have been due. I mean, let's be real. He is a redshirt freshman quarterback making his first career starts in SEC play. That's not an easy thing to do. And so for him to come in after a couple big wins in the last week or two and to have a big game, it's expected. And Tennessee, realistically, is going to be okay. But they have 2 big games remaining on their schedule when I went and looked at this morning, and that's Bama and Georgia. They go on the road to Bama, and then they get Georgia at home. And that might be the other way around, actually. But this is kind of going to decide their season. As long as they take care of business in their other games, these Bama and Georgia games are going to decide whether they're a pretender or a contender. And that's kind of the theme of this week is, yes, there was a lot of upsets, and everyone's like, well, what does this mean? What does this mean? And the reality is that we just have to sit and wait because we don't know. And there's a lot of big games left in the following 5 or 6 weeks that will decide who's legit and who's not. And Tennessee is one of those teams, right? Yeah, they lose a game to a lesser opponent in Arkansas who really isn't that great. But if they can go to Bama and get a win there and they can knock off Georgia, then there's still probably a top 3, top 5 team in the country, and maybe we'll have a chance to get that first round bye in the playoff. I'm not too worried about the Vols yet. I really like Josh Heupel, how he runs his program. So I think the Volunteers, I trust them to be okay, but they are going to have some big games, and they cannot let any of these inferior opponents that they have coming up knock them off, or else they're going to be in a really bad spot. Finally, I want to get to the Vanderbilt and Bama game. This was really weird. I was coming home last night from my cross-country meet in Walla Walla, Washington. Say that 3 times fast. But they knocked Vanderbilt, finally gets the win. I mean, this was something that no one saw coming, especially after Alabama found themselves ranked number 1 in the nation, coming off a big win against Georgia. And just kind of a sloppy game for Alabama. They have the weird pick 6 that gets tipped up in the air, and Vanderbilt runs it back for a pick 6. Outside of that, I thought the Alabama offense was fine. I mean, yeah, they had a couple empty possessions, but usually against Vanderbilt, you should be able to have a couple empty possessions and still win handedly. But Vandy came to play, and like I talked about with Missouri, they probably should have beat Missouri last week, and they just didn't. They didn't make enough plays to win that game. And this week they did, and I think, it's more about the Bama loss than it is the Vanderbilt win. But I do want to give Vandy their credit. This is a program that has been in the trenches for a really long time. I've never seen Vanderbilt football be good in my lifetime. And so to see them come in at home in a big-time environment and knock off the number 1 team in the country, it was really cool to see. But my focus is on Alabama because this team just beat Georgia last weekend. And so to turn around and lose a game like this, and I kind of expected this. I thought about talking about it on my picks this weekend. Decided not to, obviously. But when you win a big game like that and then you come off the high of beating a top 5 team in the country, your rival, you were at home, it's a massive game, maybe the game of the year, and then to go on the road and play against a team that you probably think you should beat up on, and then to kind of get your teeth kicked in, that's a wake-up call. And I think the Bama defense is not the same that we've seen in years past, obviously. When you let Vanderbilt put up 40 points on you, that's kind of a troubling sign. And so it's not that the talent isn't there with this Alabama defense. It's that the emphasis is more on the offense under Kalen DeBoer's system. And we saw this when he was at Washington. Washington had a really good offense, probably the best offense in the country statistically. But for whatever reason, they were in all these shootouts and all these close games with teams that really weren't on their level because the defense allowed so many points. And so as Alabama makes this transition from the Nick Saban era to the Kalen DeBoer era, I think we're going to see a lot more of this where Alabama's winning games in the 30s and the 40s rather than, 28-0 or 35-3, games like that where their defense is just so good. And I just think the scheming and the system prioritizes putting points on the board and allowing your defense to just bend but don't break. And so I just think going forward, Alabama, I think they're fine. I mean, listen, this is a bad loss. Yes, they have a tough schedule going forward, but I think they're a really good team. They showed that last week against Georgia. Obviously, this week they just, had a quick stumble on the road, but I think they're going to be okay. However, I do want to bring this up. In their next 6 games, they have Tennessee, Missouri, LSU, and Oklahoma. Now, when you look at that, I think they're probably going to win at least 2 to 3 of those games, given. And there's a good chance they could go 4-0. Like, if they played like they did against Georgia, they're going to be okay. However, if they show up sluggish and sloppy like they did against Vanderbilt, then they could lose 2 to 3 of those games. Who knows? And like I said earlier, we really just don't know what's going to happen this year in college football. And we expected that coming in. And I do think when you look at the whole of the SEC, I went and looked at the standings this morning, and it has Texas A&M at the top because they haven't lost a conference game. Now, I'm not really worried about that. We're at the halfway point in the season. The pressure is going to start to rise, but at the same time, there is a lot of ball left, so I just want to pump the brakes real quick. There's a lot of football left to be played. We knew this year was going to be chaotic. It really didn't feel like there was one team that was going to be like, okay, they're going to go undefeated. It's them against the rest of the teams. And I just think that, we expected this chaos, and so we have to embrace it and just know that things are going to be unexpected. They're going to be wild. And this is why we love college football, because we think we have things figured out, and then you wake up one morning on Saturday and you have 7 teams in the top 25 losing. You have 5 teams in the top 10 to top 15 losing to teams that haven't won against top 5 programs in 100 years, right? And so throughout the next few weeks, we're going to see these contenders and pretenders start to separate themselves. Next week, we have a loaded top 25 slate as we have Ohio State and Oregon. We have the Red River rivalry, Penn State, USC. And so as the season goes on, we're going to see a lot of games that are essentially knockout games, I would consider, where if you win that game, you're in contention for the playoff, you put yourself in a good spot. And if you lose, you're done. And I think that's what's so exciting about the 12-team playoff, is that when you get to the end of the year, it really gets pretty nitty-gritty in terms of who is going to be able to put themselves in position to make this playoff. Before, when it was at 4 teams, it was essentially who is your conference champ, and that's who's going to get in. But now you have all these implications where if you win the conference, you're still automatically in. But if you don't, then you're kind of just playing for an open bid, and that's hard to do, especially when there's so many good teams and just so much openness in college football this season. I would almost compare it to college basketball, where we have these March Madness runs where there's just no clear-cut number one. And so with that comes so many upsets and so many different teams that get hot at different times. And it just leaves us fans thinking, what's going to happen? We have no idea. And so that's why you have to love this sport. That's why I love this sport. And that's why we talk about it every weekend. So that's going to wrap it up here for this episode of Chop It Up Sports. This is going to be the first of 2 episodes we put out this weekend. Today, I just wanted to cover the upsets and kind of the chaos that happened taking place on Saturday. This next episode, I want to go over my new top 10 rankings, see where I think teams stand this season as we approach the halfway point, and just kind of get a feel for where our fans are, where these teams are at, and just kind of see what happens. So that's going to be it for this episode of Chop It Up. Like I said, be sure to go like, subscribe, share with a friend. We want to get this platform growing. So I appreciate you guys for listening. Drop in the comments what you think of these teams and what you thought of these upsets this week. And once again, thanks for watching.